This I just found quite randomly on the internet, and it sums up our problem really nicely. Some rock journalist, something called the Elle magazine, which I gather gets a lot of hits, he writes statements like, and this is in response to what we just heard, the radio rewrite. He says, "You can hear Reich's influence throughout popular music, especially Radiohead's Kid A and Amnesiac. Their little melodic development, a steady, almost robotic rhythmic pulse permeates the albums. Effectless voices captured in loops hover over the songs. Their lonely albums that perfectly conjure the alienation of a human lost in a technological labyrinth. Paradoxically, their emotional heft comes with the eerie lack of emotion, which is very much in keeping with the tradition that Reich and fellow minimalists established in the 60s. So my question is, would Radiohead have made their music if Steve Reich hadn't been around? I think so. I don't think Reich can really get the credit for Radiohead's music. So here's our influence thing going around. It's got to a point where Reich kind of claims credit for any music that is pulse-orientated and rhythmic and ostinato-based. But he can't really, because Reich got it from somewhere else as well. But this is the point. So remember, suddenly Steve Reich is cool because he's with Radiohead. Radiohead gets credibility because they're being influenced by Steve Reich. So I think this is just something to ponder, is this funny situation. To his credit, Steve Reich, I'm really into his thinking right now. And one of his newer statements is sort of summing up what's been going on, saying what my generation did wasn't a revolution, it was a restoration of harmony and rhythm in a whole new way. But it did bring back those essentials that people wanted, that people craved, but in a new way they hadn't heard. This is the important bit that I've heard him say in a few interviews. He's saying, now we're living back in a normal situation where the window is open between the street and the concert hall. So he's referring back to a time when there wasn't a separation between popular music and high art classical music. And he sees this convergence of like himself and Radiohead as a return to how it should be. We got to the 20th century and there was this popular music went one way and art music went another way. And he kind of claims a little bit of credit for trying to get this thing back together. And maybe it's through this alignment with current pop artists and just bringing it all together. I'm not really sure. So just as a little summing wheel, perhaps we can look this way. Here's our influencing with Steve Reich and Radiohead. And I don't really know the answers, I just think it's worth, because I've followed Reich since I was a teenager. And I've always thought he was relevant, but does the wider world have to see him sort of validated if he's with Radiohead? And what do we think of Radiohead? Are they cooler? Are they more credible? Are they more serious? Because they kind of listen to the high art composers.
Thank you. Okay, so that was just a little demonstration, a little intro into what I do with electronic mallet percussion. Throughout the course of this session, hopefully you'll leave with an idea of how some of this technology works and how, I'm going to show you how I put together something like that so that, kind of hopefully I can demystify these things for you a bit. And yeah. So my starting point for this is to assume that you guys might know nothing about how electronic percussion works. You've probably seen people using it and thought, hey, wow, that's pretty cool, or that's a bit of a gimmick, I don't know. But I'm going to assume that you guys know nothing, because I think if we get a really firm understanding of the technology and sort of how it works and how the actual physical equipment works, then we have a really strong starting point to then take off, and the sky's the limit from there. But if we really know the fundamentals, then you'll have an idea of how to jump in if you're new to this as well. I've found that what I love about playing electronic percussion, or having it in my arsenal, is that it lets me do something truly unique, right? Because no one writes music for this stuff. well, occasionally people do, but it's generally for a specific project. In general, when you're dealing with one of these instruments, you have to, I find, it forces me to create, right? It forces me to actually exercise that part of my brain that wants to generate a sound that hasn't been heard before. And that in itself I find really exciting. You know, it's kind of, it's a place where I can be really original and do something that no one else is doing. And that, you know, is kind of my big picture of why I'm into this stuff, is that it just, you know, it lets me sort of define myself and not be sort of following in anyone else's footsteps, which I think is really important to me. Okay, I'm going to divide this talk into 3 main sections, because as planning this, I found that there were 3 big topics that I wanted to cover. The topics are technology, how to set it up, and how to use sounds. Okay, so in more detail, what we've got. The technology, we're going to look at some of the instruments, and also I'm going to define the terms, some terms, and also explain in a very basic way the technology that is used to operate, that these instruments use. For setting it up, I'm going to run through a list of what you're going to need. You know, imagine that you find one secondhand, or your school has one in the storage closet, and they ask you to use it. I'm going to go through a list of things that you're kind of going to have, and also how to get it all working and how to plug it all in the right order and everything. And then lastly, I'm going to cover some sort of setups as well for different performance situations. Lastly, we've got some sounds. This is sort of my big area that I love, so I want to get here as quick as I can. I'm going to talk about how to manipulate sounds that you have, how to make them more playable, more sort of user-friendly to you and more of what you want, how to use multiple sounds at the same time, and then also I'm going to end with sort of a bigger discussion about the nature of sounds and what we have at our disposal now, and how I think about like picking sounds, because we've now got an infinite array of stuff at our disposal, and so I think it's important that we really consider it and think about and listen to what there is, and I think the results, you know, will hopefully speak for themselves.
Do we see that somehow this generated 3 responses that they didn't talk to each other? They might have seen each other on YouTube, I don't know. But they probably were mostly interested in interrogating this. So I think there's something to it. I think Brown did create something. You know, I mean, is this stretching the definition of what, you know, Brown's work is? I mean, 50 years later, 60 years later, we're still talking about it. This piece is played, you know, around the world still. You can buy it published. You can go to the library and borrow the score. So maybe he generated something, and it seemed to lead to performances of a certain essay. It's interesting to go onto his writing. Wrong button. From the same essay that we looked at last time, he published an essay on December 1952 to sort of answer, and it will address the things that came up. And he's saying exactly this. He's saying, you know, I guarantee that if I had not produced the piece of paper with those elements on it called December 1952, I would never have been able to perform the piece. So he's involved in directing performances of this himself. He does it a lot. Interestingly, what do we think of that piece being performed as an ensemble? You know, as opposed to a solo. Why not do that? He says that his mission was to get the performer to generate, essentially, play something that they hadn't played before. It's, you know, we could call it improvising, but he wants them to go beyond playing, you know, playing their cliches and stuff. What he means is not playing licks that they've practiced. A lot of times when people improvise or say they're improvising, they might just be repeating what they've practiced, but with no music in front of them. You know, jazz people learn lots of licks, and a certain school of jazz soloing is sort of based upon you know, spewing out different kinds of licks that you've already practiced. I mean, that's perhaps a slightly cynical, you know, take on it, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, just